The philosophy of Karl Marx has had a profound and decidedly mixed impact on world history, from a boon in the emancipation of labor to genocidal totalitarian dictatorships. Marxism has transformed the world. However, unlike its rival, fascism, whose links to esotericism and the occult are very well established in the literature, the esoteric or occult aspects of Marx's own philosophy are much more difficult to pin down, if they really exist at all. So in a bit of a lark of an episode, I want to discuss some aspects of esotericism and how they do and don't, and perhaps even can't, intersect with the philosophy of Karl Marx. If you're interested in magic, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out some of my other content on topics in esotericism, including some curated playlists. Also, if you want to support work like this, providing accessible, scholarly, and free content without crazy conspiracy theories and stuff on topics in esotericism, I'd hope you consider supporting my work by taking a look at my Patreon. You can use a one-time donation with PayPal. Check out the super thanks options below the video or pick up some of the merch over at the channel. But now, I guess a brief jaunt into the odd intersection of the world of esotericism and the world of very early and primitive Marxism. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. If we're going to think about something like the possibility of esotericism or occultism functioning in the thought of Karl Marx, we'd be best to turn to the matrix of his overall philosophical project, and that would be the giant Hegel. Now, Alexander Magee has well established that Hegel was pretty profoundly influenced by Hermetic thinking, broadly construed. Specifically, he argues that Hegel's dialectical idealism has several distinct Hermetic or occult characteristics. The first is the notion that the divine is somehow incomplete, and that the process of humans coming to self-consciousness is critical to the divine achieving completion as self-understanding. A strain of thinking perhaps emerging originally in the Kabbalah, but probably reaching its maturity, at least by the way that it reaches Hegel, through the theosophical speculation of Jakob Boehme. The second is a wider claim that Hegel sees all of reality as a vast system of correspondences whose interactions are profoundly informed again by alchemical and Kabbalistic literature. Third, Hegel's theory of history as an evolutionary process guided by divine cunning, or the cunning of reason, as the evolution of absolute consciousness is deeply influenced by the medieval apocalyptic prophet Joachim of Fior and his spiritual inheritors, especially the Germanic mystical tradition. You can think of people like Eckhart and Suso and Tauler. Fourth, Magee suggests that the phenomenology, that gargantuan text, is itself a kind of Hermetic ritual by which the reader undergoes the process of the transformations of consciousness necessary for the realization of human self-understanding, which again brings about the completion of the unfolding of the divine absolute. Remember, you can think of the phenomenology kind of coming-of-age story for reason and absolute knowing, as it's famously thought of as a Bildungsroman. Fifth, the central mechanic of Hegel's philosophy, the dialectical sublation or the process of Aufgehoben, is directly inherited from the mystical emanation tradition found in Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, Theosophy, and philosophers like Nicholas of Cusa. Sixth, Hegel's philosophy of intellectual history, which is for him, again, the evolution of consciousness itself, the evolution of the divine itself, is a version of perennialism and the Prisca Theologia, whereby a hidden core of consciousness is found developing through time, of course, hitherto incompletely revealed, of course, until the arrival of dialectical idealism, a la Hegel. Finally, Magee provides ample evidence of Hegel's continued and deepening interest in Hermetic and occult ideas throughout his entire career. Even as late as the 1820 Philosophy of Right contains more than a wink and a nod at the Esoteric Society of the Rosicrucians. In short, Magee argues that Hegel should be set within the tradition of Hermetic thinkers and Hermetic philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to come back and actually do a very deep dive and review of Magee's thesis, which I find both compelling but also a bit overstated, if I'm going to be honest here. For instance, yes, Hegel does say things like Jakob Böhme was the first true German philosopher. He says something similar about Spinoza, thus making it appear like the theosophical speculations of the Kabbalah of Görlitz are central to Hegel's thought. But if you know your Hegel, you'll know that this is actually a bit of a backhanded compliment. Being the first in this case means that you're among the first to undergo the process of sublation of the Aufgehoben, and you're therefore marked only as a primitive moment, an early moment in the development of mature consciousness. So if we take Hegel at his word here, he's really admitting that theosophy actually isn't going to play much of a role in the mature development of consciousness, much less in the absolute understanding that the whole system is moving towards. Further, in another instance, that wink at the Rosicrucians and the philosophy of right has to be seen also in its own historical context as well. As we know, they were never just Rosicrucians simpliciter, and the specific group that Hegel is probably referring to were actually already defunct at this point by a decade or so, and they also represented a rather reactionary, sort of hyper-conservative strain of the movement, unlike generations past. This later version of Rosicrucianism was actually much more interested in the suppression of ideals emergent from the French Revolution and squashing the rational liberalism of groups like the Bavarian Illuminati. That Illuminati, much more than they were interested in any esoteric or Hermetic ideals. Finally, there's just no doubt that Hegel is engaging and is influenced by all manner of philosophical, religious, and spiritual currents, including esoteric currents. But that was just generally true for intellectuals of his time. Even his bitter rival, Schopenhauer, uses occult ideas that were in vogue at that time to prove the existence of the primordial will that he was arguing for in the world of will and representation. Also, Hanegraaff has done much to obliterate the idea of any discrete Hermetic tradition for Hegel to be a part of in the first place, and Hegel's evolutionary philosophy necessitates that all previous philosophical, spiritual, or Hermetic ideas all have to undergo the dialectical sublation in their evolution to absolute self-knowing. No philosophy or spirituality, Hermetic or otherwise, would survive that process intact in the mature philosophy of Hegel. All in all, I think there is ample evidence that Hegel was influenced by various streams of occult and Kabbalistic and Hermetic and alchemical thinking, all very broadly construed. But overall, I do find Magee's argument at times a bit reaching, and I fail to see Hegel's mature philosophy as Hermetic in any robust sense of that term, mostly because phrases like esoteric and Gnostic and Hermetic often just function as floating signifiers rather than any systematic terms of analysis. I'm very skeptical when I see the word Gnostic used just as a general category. Like I said a moment ago, I'm going to be circling back to cover this relationship between Hegel and Esotericism in a future episode, so I'll get more into that later. But there's just a much bigger problem with claiming that Marxism or communism or wokeism or cultural Marxism or Judeo-Bolshevism or whatever reactionary conspiracy theory that the dollar store phalangists have cooked up today are at any form Hermetic or have any occult dimensions, in that they are derivative of the Hegelian philosophy. As you probably know, the Hegelian philosophy was split after Hegel's death into right-wing and left-wing or old and new Hegelians, with the left Hegelians represented by folks like Ruge and Feuerbach and Bauer and others, rejecting precisely the statism and the religious orthodoxy of the old guard that you see at the later Hegel, and they issued forth blistering critiques of religion, especially Christianity, and they were unabashed in their utopianism. This critique of religion would be pushed all the way to an absolute rejection of the very idealism at the heart of Hegel's project. And the utopian strand would itself become a revolutionary rejection of the very civil society-based liberal nation-states that Hegel held that were at the end of history, specifically the end of history as the Prussian state and its state religion. This inversion of the Hegelian philosophy would reach its absolute fruition precisely in Marx's project, who famously claims that he found Hegel standing on his head and he put him back on his feet, inverting a dialectically idealist theory of history for a dialectical materialist one. Thus, Marx would have and did just trash any and all of the mystical, esoteric, or occult dimensions of Hegel's philosophy, and philosophical language for that matter, if honestly he took notice of them at all. There's no evidence that he did, as his own philosophical project, that is to say Marx's philosophical project, deepened and became precisely more radical in exactly that materialism. So much so that later Marxists like Althusser saw Marx's earlier work, like the famed 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts of the young Marx with their famous theory of alienation, all of that was still seen as infected with idealism and unscientific philosophical humanism. Thus, Marx's project was precisely in the deracination of the more idealist elements of the Hegelian philosophy, and would have found occult and mystical trends within that Hegelian philosophy all the more pernicious and backwards and frankly superstitious and silly. In fact, in the first few generations of Marxist philosophers, it wasn't Hegel that was rehabilitated. It was Kant, of all people, with the development of the reflection theory of consciousness, often taking its cue precisely from Neo-Kantianism. When the Hungarian Marxist Lukács first attempted a more public synthesis of Marxism and Hegelianism in the early 1920s, even just the language of, philosophical analysis and technical terminology, something of a rehabilitation of Hegel's way of thinking, he was publicly condemned by one of the leading Bolsheviks of the time, Zinoviev, the first chairman of the Third International. To put it bluntly, Marx and Marxism radically rejected any religious or spiritual, much less Hermetic or Gnostic elements emergent from the Hegelian philosophy, regardless if those elements influenced Hegel himself. The Hermetic Hegel was long dead by the time Marx arrived, and any necromancy to reanimate his idealist philosophy was soundly forbidden by the stupidity, frankly, of the dogmatic Marxism that emerged later. Another bizarre conspiracy theory I've heard is that Marxism takes its esoteric lead from the Kabbalah or Frankism because Marx was Jewish. Who didn't see this coming? So yes, Marx's father was Jewish, he wasn't a rabbi, but he converted a year or so before Karl was born to avoid state-based anti-Semitic laws that prevented him from practicing law. From what we can tell, not only was Heinrich Marx uncommitted enough in Judaism to convert from it, but he wasn't even that interested in Protestantism either. He was kind of just a normie Enlightenment kind of dude. Karl's mother, Henriette Pressburg, who also converted, but who grew up in an Orthodox upbringing in sort of Dutch Jewry, well, it doesn't seem that she had much of a religious impact on her family either. Further, Marx's Jewish lineage was precisely the object of anti-Semitic scorn heaped upon him during his life and political activity, despite him having no connection with Judaism in any form so far as we can tell. In fact, Marx himself was a bit of an anti-Semite. His 1843-1844 on the Jewish question is disgustingly anti-Semitic, and that you have to see Marxists jump through all kinds of mental hoops and mental gymnastics to apologize it away. So no, aside from the lunacy of yet another conspiracy theory, there's no secret Kabbalah or hidden Rothschildian Frankism to be found in Marx's thinking. Rather, he was much more likely, and he did engage in the casual Victorian anti-Semitism of his day, probably as compensation for his own Jewish heritage, sadly. Internalized anti-Semitism. Sad stuff. But all of this pales in comparison to Marx's very clear statements on religion itself and by extension any spirituality, esoteric or otherwise. Marx wrote in the famous section of the 1843 Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. You know it, say it with me now. It is the opium of the people, or the opium of the masses, the opium des volkes. Now, this quotation has been much, much abused as a part of totalitarian attempts to impose state atheism, and Marx's structural functionalist argument here about religion is actually a lot more complex than people let on at first. He's certainly not merely deriding religion as a diluting, poisonous drug. Rather, he's noting, as was appropriate given the use of opium in his time, that religion functions as a kind of social anesthesia, providing people in a brutal world some respite, something of the sublime, a sense of meaning to it all, a hope for some future life worth living, even if that has to follow after our physical death. But, to that point, like opium, that's ultimately a delusional dream, as addictive as it is unable to deliver on those promises, even going so far as to further immiserate precisely those seeking that respite, and thus driving them into the clutches of religious hegemony. Thus, religion has a dual function in this kind of argument. Religion as a opium which functions as a kind of social analgesic, but also, and much more commonly noted, as an addictive poison which ultimately serves to further immiserate human beings. All of which is even perhaps further true in the past given the institutional state religions of Marx's day, and certainly prior to his day. That's certainly true of the state religion of Marxism as well, if we're going to be honest. Of course, Marx pioneered and accepted some version of what we might now call the secularization hypothesis. That is to say that improved social conditions predict a decline in religious life, such that religion would ultimately wither on the vine as he has it. And, in many ways, especially at the level of religion, in that it functions as a force of social and state hegemony, he's been basically proven correct. But Marx wasn't immune to the social forces of his day, and one of the elements of those forces was the Victorian pervasive interest in the supernatural, even if he rejected the existence of it. And in his very important, seminal 1867 work, Das Kapital, Volume 1, one of the only works that he actually brought to literary completion, looking at you, Grundrisse, in German ideology, elements of the supernatural abound in that book. Specifically, I would argue that Das Kapital, at least in its more literary aspects, is actually something of a Gothic novel. When you peel away the descriptions of shoe production and reams of linen, and you get a sense of the more literary elements of Das Kapital, the text just abounds in flesh-eating ghouls, blood-sucking vampires, ghosts and specters and hobgoblins. Recall the famous line from the Communifesto that there is a specter of communism haunting Europe. In some translations, it's actually a hobgoblin haunting Europe, which is way better. Even the constitution of the worker as a kind of golem by the hideous forces of capitalist production, Das Kapital is, in effect, a story about a monster, capitalism, and it deploys numerous literary devices to capture precisely that monstrosity. And that should be totally unsurprising. Frankenstein had appeared when Marx himself was only a toddler, baby Marx, and the rest of the 19th century would be the golden age of literary Gothic tales with ghosts and haunted castles and especially the vampire. We have Polidori's 1819 The Vampire, a dozen or more vampire plays set for stage, both in English and German, the penny dreadful epic Varney the Vampire in 1847, then eventually Carmilla in 1872, and of course Stoker's Dracula in 1897, which is itself actually kind of just as much early sci-fi as it is horror in many ways. I would suggest that while the work has been appreciated as an important piece of history in terms of political economy and philosophy, it should also be seen within its literary context as a work of Gothic horror. With the great vampire capitalist feasting on the flesh and blood of the workers, an economic monster that can only be slayed by the united forces of the working class. Those more literary elements of Das Kapital, I would argue that they should actually find their way into anthologies of Gothic horror, with the bourgeoisie nested right between Varney and Dracula as historically important literary vampires. I suppose another more esoteric element in Marxist thinking is also the kind of ghosts that operate in his thinking, the ghosts in his system. Marx's philosophy, as I pointed out, is decidedly materialist. Now, that doesn't mean that Marx was a strict physicalist in the way we use that term now, and to be honest, dialectical materialism is a rather peculiar, even exotic form of materialism. For instance, Marx in the German Ideology, the closest thing that we get to some statement of the philosophy of Marxism, at least from the period of the lifetime of Marx and Engels, we actually have something like the notion of emergent properties, specifically the emergent property of ruling ideas, which seems to have the ability to supervene back down upon the material base of the material forces of production. Thus, while the system is strongly materialist, we also seem to have an example here of something like strong emergence of these ruling ideas, at least as part of the 1846 German ideology. Those ideas seem to have an effective causal agency all their own. A similar case of emergence, perhaps even another case of strong emergence, also appears in Das Kapital with the appearance of the commodity and the social relationships that it engenders. In fact, in that most famous first chapter, Marx actually notes that the commodity is abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. But why? Because we encounter the products of human labor not as such, but in capitalist society as social relations in the form of exchange values. Thus, commodities gain a kind of spectral life. They become a fetish, a kind of supernatural being, otherwise simply made of wood or stone. Commodities take on a secondary life, in that we perceive their economic value and not the labor that went into producing them as inherent to them. Thus, an irreal economic abstraction in the interest of the owning class is made to obliterate what Marx thought was the fundamentally real labor power, and the power of the class that precisely does that labor through which society is actually constituted, and which is robbed of them over time. Thus, the commodity has a form of a fetish-like character that we encounter a world of things produced through labor power whose value is ultimately derived from that spent labor, but which always appears to us as having their value merely in the social relations of economic exchange. Thus, we don't own the things we make. The things we make are made to own us in the interests of the profits of those that didn't make them. What's fascinating about this concept of commodity fetishism is that, like the ruling ideas of the German ideology, the spectral reality of the commodity relation has the ability to shape social reality, even productive reality, precisely in how it deforms consciousness itself into what Marx calls ideology, or Engels sometimes refers to as false consciousness. Again, another case of strong emergence in Marx's system, where an irreal, non-material entity, like commodities, which again Marx uses metaphysical and theological language to describe, perhaps somewhat tongue-in-cheek and a little bit ironically, but still has the ability to transform social reality and consciousness, even the structure of desire itself, something that marketing has made dramatic use of. Thank you, Bernays. Think of all those people who can't leave their house without putting on some kind of cosmetics. That would include deodorant too, as informed by specific late capitalist beauty standards. That's mind control, if there ever was such a thing. Ideology as formed by commodity fetishism makes the CIA and MK Ultra look like a bunch of childish amateurs when compared to L'Oreal or Lancome. Maybe it's you, maybe it's Maybelline, but it's definitely false consciousness. And that function of ideology, to my mind, it just seems like a materialist version of demonic possession has now entered into the modern world. No longer do we have supernatural devils and his demons controlling our minds, our wills, and our libidos, but now the satanic forces of capitalism and the commodity relation influencing our false consciousness. And here again, this demonic, spectral, and non-material force is at the very heart of Marx's dialectical materialism. It's a fascinating ghost in the machine, again with a certain kind of Gothic element, capitalism functioning a bit like a satanic force bent on world domination through possession as false consciousness, or something like a house haunted by malevolent forces, poltergeists tormenting the workers of the world. It has all the elements of something like a medieval world full of witches and demons, but now it's capitalists and bosses. Lastly, Marx carries with him perhaps the most important dimension of religion as it's developed in the past 2,500 years or so: apocalypticism. Marx's theory of history, as much as we get it in a few paragraphs there in the German Ideology, truly takes the linear development of the once theological form of thinking found in people like Joachim Fior and transforms it into a materialist arrow of time propelled by relentless class struggle. In this vast Marxist mythology, we have the sense of apocalyptic imminence. All of the hitherto history has culminated into this final battle between Gog and Magog. I mean, the underdog historic proletariat and the demonic vampiric bourgeoisie. The titanic battle is near to reach its epic conclusion soon and in our lifetimes. Late-stage capitalism, though, seems to always get a little bit later. Before, of course, finally the monster is defeated and the heavenly utopia of communism is ushered in. Every tear is wiped away. No more exploitation or crying or pain, for the old order of things will have passed away, and Lenin lives. And every time I talk to a bright-eyed 25-year-old communist quoting the divine scriptures of, Karl or Lenin or Trotsky or Mao, I can hear the new revelation, a new scripture, a new religion with saints and sinners and prophets and monsters and heaven and hell, and all of that a sense of dogmatic certainty that the same doom that will come to the capitalists will come to the sinners and the devil in the same breath. Marxism can and very often does function as an apocalyptic religion with a mythology and scriptures, just as much, perhaps even more so now, as it ever was a materialist philosophy of labor, economics, and history. And especially that way, as an apocalyptic religion, it fits very well within this world, the world of mythologies of the arcane. So, a little episode on Marx to celebrate International Workers' Day. As you may know, I grew up in the working class. My dad was a pipe fitter, and I've always been a rather boring, somewhat cynical Marxist myself. In fact, historical materialism is my default way of doing history on this channel. So if you, hate Marx and hate historical materialism, but you like what I do here at Esoterica, you might want to think about that for a minute. That's a thing. But that said, it'd be fun to come around next year and, around May Day to cover topics in the esoteric history of, labor history, Marxism, anarchism, the Soviet Union, things like the socialism of folks like Eliphas Levi, etc. There's a lot of interesting stuff in Spiritism and socialism. And speaking of that topic, by the way, there's a fantastic book called The Occult in Russia and the Soviet Union, edited by Rosenthal, and well worth picking up if you're interested in specifically esotericism and occultism in the Soviet Union. But until then, you got nothing to lose but your chains. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge. Thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane of history, philosophy, and religion as the opium of the masses.